Imagine for a second that the sun has just gone down. No street lights, no phone screen glowing in your hand, no flick of a switch, just absolute total darkness. And out there in that darkness you can hear things moving, big things. You are cold, you are hungry, and you're terrified. That was the reality of life for hundreds of thousands of years. That was the default setting of being human, or almost human anyway. And then one night someone did something that no living creature had ever intentionally done before. They made fire. Now hold on. I know what you might be thinking. Fire. Really? We are spending 45 minutes on fire? But here's the thing. This wasn't just someone lighting a campfire to roast marshmallows. What happened approximately 400,000 years ago was arguably the single most important moment in the entire history of our species. Maybe the most important moment in the history of life on Earth, because whoever figured out how to deliberately create fire didn't just change their own life. They changed every life that would ever come after them, including yours, including mine, right now. The warmth in your home, the food on your table, the city you live in, the civilization you take for granted, none of it exists without that first deliberate spark. So today, we're going back, way, way back. We're going to try to figure out who started the fire, how they did it, and maybe most fascinatingly of all, why. What drove someone to take a rock, smash it against another rock in just the right way, and for the first time in history, decide that the result was something useful. Stick with me because this story goes places you might not expect. It touches on evolution, brain science, social psychology, cooking, war, language, and even spirituality. By the end of this, you will never look at a candle flame the same way again. To truly understand why fire was such a revolution, you first have to understand the world without it. And I mean really understand it, not just intellectually, but in your gut. Before deliberate fire, the world after dark was an almost entirely different planet. Everything dangerous got an 8 to 10 hour advantage every single night. Predators that hunted by smell and heat could move through pitch darkness like it was broad daylight. Early hominins, the ancestors of modern humans, could not. So what did they do? Mostly, they climbed. They got up into trees, onto rocky ledges, into caves if they were lucky. They huddled together for warmth and waited. Every single night, they just waited for the sun to come back. Think about what that does to a population over generations. You lose roughly a third of every day to defensive inactivity. You can't work. You can't socialize beyond whispering. You can't see to make tools. Cold nights mean higher caloric burn just to stay alive, and the cold itself was often genuinely life-threatening, especially in northern latitudes or during glacial periods when temperatures plummeted after sunset. Now, hominins weren't completely hopeless here. They had each other. Group living was itself a major survival strategy. And there's evidence that early humans occasionally benefited from naturally occurring fire, lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous brush fires. They may have learned very early on to recognize that areas recently scorched by natural fires were actually safer. Pre-animals fled, predators dispersed, and the open ground made it easier to see anything approaching. Some researchers believe early hominins may have followed natural fires, the way scavengers follow predators, hanging back at a safe distance, then moving in to benefit from the aftermath. But there's a massive difference between benefiting from something that nature hands you and being able to create it yourself, on demand, whenever you need it. That leap from passive observer to active maker is one of the greatest cognitive jumps in the entire fossil record, and it didn't happen overnight. So how do we actually know when deliberate fire-making began? This is where things get genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated, because evidence this old is extraordinarily difficult to interpret. Let's start with what archaeologists actually look for when they're trying to detect ancient fire use at a site. They're looking for a few key things: burned bones and plant material, ash deposits, heat-altered stone, charcoal clusters, and crucially the pattern of these things, because fire from a lightning strike or a wildfire leaves a completely different signature than fire that was contained, maintained, and repeatedly used in the same spot. One of the most compelling sites in the world for early fire evidence is Qesem Cave in Israel. Excavations there have uncovered repeated fire use dating back somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago. What makes Qesem extraordinary isn't just the age, it's the context. The burned bones found there aren't scattered randomly, they're concentrated. There's evidence of a central hearth area that was used again and again. There are cut marks on animal bones suggesting systematic butchery, and the ash layers are deep and dense, indicating not a one-time event, but habitual, intentional, organized fire use. Then there's Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, which pushes the timeline back even further, possibly to 1 million years ago for fire use, though whether that was controlled fire-making or opportunistic use of natural fire is still debated. And Beech's Pit in England, which dates to around 400,000 years ago and shows evidence of fire in a decidedly cold northern environment where natural fire would have been relatively rare, making it harder to explain away as accidental. Here's the key thing: the further back you go, the harder it is to definitively separate deliberate fire-making from fire use. Early hominins may have been using fire, carrying embers, maintaining natural fires, keeping flames alive, long before they figured out how to actually produce fire from scratch. And that distinction matters enormously. Keeping a fire going is a skill. Making one from nothing is a different beast entirely. The evidence strongly suggests that by 400,000 years ago, in multiple locations across the Old World, fire was not a lucky accident. It was a tool, a technology, something being deliberately managed and most likely produced. And the beings doing it were not quite us, but they were getting very, very close. This is where it gets really interesting, because 400,000 years ago is a complicated time in human evolution. We're not talking about Homo sapiens. We don't show up in the fossil record until about 300,000 years ago at the earliest. So who was striking those first deliberate sparks? The leading candidate is Homo heidelbergensis, a species that many paleoanthropologists consider the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. They were big-brained, physically powerful, and remarkably capable toolmakers. Their stone technology, known as the Acheulean tradition, included beautifully crafted hand axes that required planning, patience, and precise motor control to produce. These were not simple creatures, they were hunters, and evidence suggests they were hunting large game, including horses, rhinos, and elephants. That takes coordination, communication, and strategy. Homo heidelbergensis was spread across Africa, Europe, and possibly parts of Asia during this period, which is one reason why fire evidence appears in multiple places at roughly the same time. It's possible, and this is a genuinely thrilling thought, that fire-making was not invented once and spread outward, but was independently discovered by different populations of these hominins in different places, perhaps within the same few tens of thousands of years. Now, this raises a provocative question. If multiple groups figured it out independently, what does that tell us? It suggests that by 400,000 years ago, the cognitive toolkit for deliberate fire-making, the planning, the cause and effect reasoning, the ability to think ahead, was already widely present in our ancestor species. The invention wasn't a single flash of individual genius. It was waiting to happen. The brains were ready. It was just a matter of time and circumstance. And then there are the Neanderthals, who appear a bit later in the record, perhaps 200 to 300,000 years ago. but who almost certainly inherited fire-making knowledge from their Homo heidelbergensis ancestors. Neanderthal hearths are some of the best documented evidence of deliberate, controlled fire use we have. They weren't just keeping fires, they were managing them, using them for cooking, for warmth, possibly for hafting tools by heating birch tar. Neanderthals were sophisticated fire users, which means their ancestors, whoever first figured this out, must have been too. Okay, so how was it actually done? Because there's a gap between understanding that fire is useful and understanding how to make it. That gap requires experimentation. It requires curiosity. It requires failure and trying again and paying attention to what went wrong. In other words, it requires a very specific kind of intelligence. There are two main methods of producing fire from scratch that ancient hominins would have had access to. The first is percussion, striking a hard stone like flint or pyrite against another stone or mineral to produce sparks hot enough to ignite a tinder bundle. The second is friction, rubbing or rotating wood against wood in a way that generates enough heat to create a glowing ember that can then be blown into a flame. Percussion is in some ways the more intuitive discovery. Here's why. Hominins had been napping, making stone tools by striking rocks together for well over 2 million years before deliberate firemaking appeared. Every time a flint napper struck a fresh edge off a piece of stone, there were sparks. For millions of years, those sparks were just a side effect that nobody paid much attention to. But at some point, someone paid attention. Maybe they were working near dry grass. Maybe it was a particularly arid day, and the tinder was perfect. Maybe sparks landed on something, and the smell of smoke made them look up, and instead of waving it away, they leaned in. That moment of paying attention, of connecting cause to effect in a new way, is the cognitive revolution hiding inside the fire revolution. It's not that hominins suddenly got smarter. It's that the accumulated intelligence they already had was, for the first time, being directed at a new problem. And once someone made that connection, even once, the knowledge had value. It could be taught, it could be shared, it could be remembered. The friction method, typically using a bow drill or a hand drill, is somewhat more complex and may have developed later, though it's hard to say definitively. What we do know is that by the time Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens are well documented in the record, fire-making was clearly a learned, transmittable skill, something passed from generation to generation, the way you might teach someone to knap a flint blade or tan a hide. Fire-making had become culture. Now we get to what I think is the most fascinating question of all, not how fire was made, but why? What was the driving pressure? What problem was so severe, so persistent, that the solution, striking rocks together near dry tinder and carefully nursing the result into a flame, was worth figuring out? The most compelling answer, at least for the initial spark of fire use even before deliberate making, comes down to a very simple and relentless pressure: hunger, specifically the need for more calories. The biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued, and argued brilliantly, that cooking with fire is not just something our ancestors did, it's something our bodies literally evolved to require. His hypothesis is called the cooking hypothesis, and it goes something like this. Raw food is hard to digest, even for a creature with a large gut designed for fibrous plant matter. Extracting maximum nutrition from raw meat or raw tubers requires enormous energy and time. Cooking changes everything. It breaks down cell walls, denatures proteins, gelatinizes starches. It makes food dramatically more digestible. More digestible food means more calories extracted per bite. More calories means more energy available for growth, including brain growth. And here's the payoff. The human brain is extraordinarily expensive. It makes up only about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of your daily calories. Maintaining a large, complex brain is metabolically ruinous unless you have a very reliable, high-calorie diet. Cooking, Wrangham argues, is what made it possible. Before cooking, the caloric demand of a growing brain would have been impossible to meet consistently. After cooking, you have a surplus. And evolution, being the relentless optimizer it is, invested that surplus straight back into more brain. If this hypothesis is correct, and the evidence is building, then fire didn't just change what our ancestors ate, it changed what they became. The trajectory toward modern human intelligence, toward language, toward culture, toward everything that makes us us. It runs directly through a campfire. Hunger didn't just motivate fire use. Hunger, solved by fire, made us smart enough to eventually understand hunger itself. But let's not romanticize the fire of 400,000 years ago too much. Yes, it was a cooking tool. Yes, it was a source of warmth. But fire was also something much more immediate and visceral. It was a weapon, or at least a defense. Consider what fire means to other animals. With very few exceptions, most creatures, including the large predators that would have been constant threats, have an instinctive fear of fire. The sight, the smell, the crackling sound triggers something deep and evolutionary in almost every vertebrate brain. It means danger. It means run. For a group of hominins, a fire at the entrance of a cave or at the perimeter of a campsite wasn't just light and warmth. It was a force field, a predator deterrent of extraordinary reliability. This defensive value of fire may actually be one of the earliest motivations for not just using fire, but maintaining it. If you had a natural fire burning nearby, from a lightning strike or a lava flow, the selective pressure to keep it going would have been intense. Groups that managed to maintain fire longer had better protection. They slept more safely. They lost fewer members to nocturnal predators. They thrived more than groups without it, and that differential survival would have created real evolutionary pressure favoring the cognitive traits needed to manage and eventually produce fire. There's also a more aggressive use to consider. Deliberately set fires can be used to drive game animals toward waiting hunters, to clear terrain for movement, or to deny resources to rival groups. Some researchers have proposed that fire was used as a tool of territorial control, not just protecting a campsite, but actively reshaping the landscape. There's even anthropological evidence from much more recent populations of hunter-gatherers that strategic burning of vegetation was a form of land management, a way of encouraging the regrowth of plants that attract game. If firemaking goes back 400,000 years, it's not a stretch to think some form of environmental fire management began almost as soon as deliberate firemaking did. Here's something I want you to think about. In almost every culture throughout human history, fire sits at the center. Literally, the hearth is not just a cooking appliance. It is the gathering point. It is where the group comes together. It is where stories are told and knowledge is shared and bonds are formed. And the question is, did fire create that social dynamic, or did the social dynamic already exist and fire just formalized it? The answer is almost certainly both in a feedback loop. Before fire, the social dynamics of hominin groups were shaped by daylight. You cooperated during the day, you hunted, foraged, made tools, cared for young. At night, you clustered defensively and were mostly inactive. Fire changed the equation dramatically. A hearth extends the social day. By firelight, you can continue working. You can groom social bonds. You can, and this is enormous, you can talk, not just signal, not just gesture, but actually sit face to face in the light and communicate. The anthropologist Polly Wisner studied modern hunter-gatherer societies, specifically the Kung San of southern Africa, and analyzed the difference between daytime conversation and nighttime fireside conversation. The difference was remarkable. Daytime talk was mostly practical, logistics, complaints, criticism, economic negotiation. But nighttime talk by the fire was dominated by storytelling, humor, ritual, and the discussion of social relationships. In other words, the fire turned a survival mechanism into a cultural institution. If something similar was happening 400,000 years ago, and given the deep similarities between all human social behavior, it almost certainly was, then fire didn't just feed bodies, it fed minds, it fed identities, it created the conditions for collective memory, for tradition, for teaching complex skills across generations. Without the fireside gathering, you arguably don't get cumulative culture. And without cumulative culture, you don't get any of the things that define civilization. The fire is at the root of all of it. Hey, if you're finding this journey through deep history as mind-blowing as I do me a quick favor and hit that like button, and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps more people find this content, and we've still got a lot of fire to cover. Let's keep going. Let's spend a little more time on cooking, because the implications of cooking with fire are so far-reaching that most people dramatically underestimate them. We touched on Wrangham's cooking hypothesis earlier, but I want to go deeper, because this is where the story of fire becomes the story of the human body itself. When you look at the anatomy of modern humans compared to our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, the differences are striking. Our guts are significantly smaller. Our teeth are considerably smaller and weaker. Our jaws are less powerful. Our stomachs produce less acid. By almost every measure, we are worse at processing raw food than our primate cousins. This is puzzling unless you factor in cooking. Because cooking is essentially pre-digestion, it does the work outside the body that other animals have to do inside. And when you outsource digestion to fire, you no longer need an enormous digestive system. You can get away with a smaller gut. And a smaller gut is not just neutral, it's actually advantageous. The gut is metabolically expensive too. A smaller gut frees up energy. Combined with the extra calories from more digestible cooked food, the net energy surplus available to a cooking hominin was substantial. Substantial enough to fuel brain expansion. Substantial enough to support earlier weaning of offspring. Because cooked food could nourish infants better than raw plant matter. Substantial enough to reduce the time spent chewing. Modern humans spend a fraction of the time chewing that chimps do, which freed up hours every day for other activities. Other activities like making better tools, like socializing more, like sleeping in a way that allows for the deep REM sleep associated with complex memory consolidation and creative problem solving. The cascade of changes triggered by cooking with fire is almost impossible to fully trace because it reaches so far in so many directions. But here's a useful way to think about it. Cooking didn't just make food easier to eat. It rewrote the biological contract between our bodies and our environment, and once that contract was rewritten, there was no going back. We are, in the most literal biological sense, cooked food animals. We are not designed to thrive on raw food. Fire made us what we are. We've been dancing around this idea of brain expansion, so let's go there directly because the timeline is genuinely extraordinary when you lay it out. 3 million years ago, the brain of Australopithecus, our very early ancestor, was roughly 400 to 500 cubic centimeters in volume, about the size of a modern chimpanzee brain. Then, around 2 million years ago, with the emergence of Homo habilis and then Homo erectus, brain size started creeping upward. By 1.5 million years ago, we're looking at brains of around 900 cubic centimeters. By 800,000 years ago, some specimens are pushing 1,000 to 1,200 cubic centimeters. And by the time Homo heidelbergensis is on the scene, the probable firemaker of 400,000 years ago, we're looking at brains of 1,200 to 1,400 cubic centimeters, approaching the modern human range. That acceleration in brain size is not random. It tracks with major developments in diet and behavior, and it tracks with fire. Now, correlation isn't causation, and I want to be careful not to oversimplify. Brain expansion was almost certainly driven by multiple pressures: social complexity, tool use, ecological variability, sexual selection. But the energy argument is hard to dismiss. Big brains require big energy budgets, and the best candidate for providing those budgets reliably and efficiently across hundreds of thousands of years is cooked food. There's also a neurological angle that goes beyond mere caloric supply, the kind of cognition required to make fire deliberately. Planning ahead, understanding cause and effect across a delay, teaching abstract skills to others requires a level of executive function and working memory that is genuinely advanced. In a sense, fire-making is both a product of increased brain capacity and a driver of it. The smarter you are, the better you can make and use fire. The better you can make and use fire, the more calories you get, and the smarter your offspring can be. It is a cognitive feedback loop that once started is very hard to stop. Here's a question that researchers genuinely argue about, and I find it one of the most philosophically interesting debates in all of paleoanthropology. Was fire-making invented once and spread outward from that single point? Or was it invented independently multiple times in different places by different populations? The answer matters, because it tells us something profound about the nature of intelligence and invention. If fire-making was a single discovery that spread via cultural transmission through migration, trade, teaching, then it was a unique event, a singularity. If it was independently discovered multiple times, it tells us that given the right cognitive toolkit, fire-making was an almost inevitable discovery. The evidence leans toward multiple independent discoveries. Here's why. The sites where fire evidence appears around 400,000 years ago are not clustered in one place and radiating outward. They appear in Africa, in Europe, in the Middle East, within a relatively short geological time span. Given the state of hominin migration at the time, it's not straightforward to draw a single dispersal route that connects all of them cleanly. More parsimoniously, given populations of Homo heidelbergensis spread across the Old World with similar cognitive abilities and similar tool-making traditions, multiple independent discoveries of fire-making make sense. And this has a fascinating parallel in the history of human invention generally. The wheel, agriculture, writing, mathematics, many of the most transformative inventions in human history appear to have been independently discovered in multiple places within relatively short time windows, not because invention is easy, but because once a population reaches a certain cognitive and social threshold, certain discoveries become almost inevitable. They are, to use a biological metaphor, convergent evolution of ideas. Fire-making may be the oldest and most consequential example of this pattern in all of human history. I want to take a slight turn here, because I think one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the fire story is its spiritual one. And I don't mean this in a vague, hand-wavy way. I mean it in a very specific, empirically supported way. Almost every human culture that has ever existed has a relationship with fire that goes beyond the practical. Fire is sacred, it is divine, it appears in the myths and cosmologies of cultures on every continent. The Greeks had Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity and being eternally punished for it, as if fire was so powerful a gift that it was almost transgressive to possess it. In Hindu tradition, Agni is one of the most important gods, the deity of fire, the sacred intermediary between humans and the divine. In Zoroastrianism, fire is the most sacred element, the visible manifestation of truth and purity. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, fire features prominently in Dreamtime stories. Native American traditions from dozens of nations feature fire as a central sacred element. Why this universal pattern? Why does fire show up as sacred across cultures that have had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years? The most compelling explanation is that the sacredness of fire is a cultural echo of its original revolutionary importance. For hundreds of thousands of years, fire was the difference between safety and danger, between warmth and death, between nourishment and hunger. It was the most powerful tool anyone had ever had. It changed everything, and in the minds of the beings who first had it, that kind of transformative power would have been inseparable from the numinous, the sense of something beyond ordinary understanding. Fire wasn't just useful, it was miraculous, and that perception became embedded so deeply in human psychology that it survived into our mythologies, our rituals, and our spiritual traditions long after the practical miracle of fire had become mundane. The next time you light a candle at a dinner table, or sit around a campfire, and feel that inexplicable pull toward the flame, that almost hypnotic, soothing quality of watching fire, you are experiencing an emotion that has been building in the human brain for 400,000 years. It is one of the most ancient feelings you have. Here's one of the boldest ideas in this whole space, and I want to be upfront that it is speculative, but it is seriously entertained by serious researchers. The idea is this: fire did not just change what hominins ate and how they stayed warm. Fire may have played a direct role in the evolution of human language. The connection runs through the fireside gathering. We established earlier that fire extended the social day, and that nighttime fireside talk in hunter-gatherer societies is dominated by stories, social discussion, and complex communication. Now extend that backward. Hominins sitting around a fire for hours every evening, under pressure to communicate, to share information, to coordinate, to bond. That is a powerful selective environment for more sophisticated vocal communication. The fire didn't just illuminate faces, it may have illuminated the value of talking. And there's an anatomical thread here too, the changes in hominin throat anatomy that allowed for the kind of complex, modulated vocalization we call language, the descended larynx, the increased breath control associated with thoracic vertebrae changes. These begin appearing in the fossil record in the range of several 100,000 years ago, precisely the period when fire use is becoming widespread and habitual. Now, language almost certainly has multiple evolutionary drivers, but if you're looking for a behavioral context that would put intense, repeated, nightly selective pressure on improved communication, nightly sessions of close social interaction by firelight for hundreds of thousands of generations, it's hard to think of a better one. Fire may not have given us language directly, but it may have created the social pressure cooker inside which language became irresistibly advantageous. And once language arrived, even rudimentary language, even simple shared symbolic communication, the ability to transmit fire-making knowledge itself became dramatically easier. You could describe what to do, not just demonstrate it. You could name the stones, name the tinder, name the steps. Fire made better communication possible, and better communication made fire more transmissible. Another feedback loop, another upward spiral. Let's zoom out for a second, because Homo heidelbergensis and their descendants aren't the only candidates in this story. What about other hominin species? What about animals entirely? First, the animals. There is actually documented behavior of birds, specifically certain Australian raptors, including the black kite and the whistling kite, deliberately carrying burning sticks from one location to another to spread fires and flush out prey. This was reported by Aboriginal Australians for centuries before Western scientists took it seriously, and in recent years it has been formally documented and published in peer-reviewed literature. These birds are not making fire, but they are using fire as a tool deliberately, intentionally. This is remarkable. It suggests that the perception of fire as a useful force, not merely as a danger to flee from, is not uniquely human. Among hominins, the picture is more complicated. Homo erectus, which preceded Homo heidelbergensis, may have used fire in some form, There is evidence from sites in Africa and Asia that pushes possible fire use back to 1 million years or more. Whether Erectus used fire habitually or only opportunistically is debated, but the capacity for fire use and perhaps the beginning of fire making may go back further than we've been discussing. And then there are the Neanderthals who we've mentioned. Neanderthals were clearly unambiguously fire users. They cooked food, they used fire to process birch bark into pitch for hufting tools, a surprisingly sophisticated chemical process, and they maintained hearths. Whether Neanderthals and early modern humans ever shared fire-making knowledge, traded fire-starting materials, or learned from each other is a tantalizing open question. Given that we now know Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred, the evidence is right there in modern non-African human DNA. It seems plausible that cultural exchange, including fire-making techniques, was also part of their interaction. The fire story may be more collaborative and more intertwined across species than we tend to assume. At this point, we've covered the who, the how, the why, the social implications, the biological implications, the cognitive implications, but I want to make sure we do justice to what comes next. Because the story of fire at 400,000 years ago is, in a sense, just the opening chapter of an incredibly long novel. Fire doesn't just change the people who first use it, it changes the world, and not gradually in a smooth linear way, it changes it in lurches as new applications of fire are discovered on top of old ones. Here's a rough arc of what follows. First, cooking, warmth, and predator defense, which we've covered. These benefits manifest almost immediately and drive rapid adoption. Then comes more sophisticated food processing, not just cooking meat, but roasting tubers, boiling liquids in containers, smoking food to preserve it. Preservation of food through fire dramatically extends the range of environments homins can survive in, because you can now carry shelf-stable food on long migrations instead of needing to find fresh calories every day. Then comes fire as a craft tool. Heating certain minerals changes their chemical properties. Ochre, when heated, changes color and becomes more vibrant, and ochre-based pigments are among the earliest evidence of symbolic and artistic behavior in the human record. Wood can be hardened by careful fire treatment. Pottery, one of the transformative technologies of the Neolithic, is impossible without fire hot enough to vitrify clay. Metal smelting, the foundation of the Bronze Age and Iron Age, is impossible without fire. The entire trajectory of material culture from flint hand axes to steel skyscrapers passes through fire at every step. Then there's agriculture. The deliberate burning of landscapes to clear forest, encourage grassland, and drive game was practiced long before formal agriculture. But the same principle, using fire to reshape the environment to human advantage, underpins the slash-and-burn agriculture that kick-started settled civilization in dozens of locations around the world. And settled civilization brings writing, and writing brings recorded knowledge, and recorded knowledge brings the acceleration of every human technology from medicine to engineering to digital computers. So when we talk about whoever started that first deliberate fire 400,000 years ago, they didn't just change their immediate circumstances. They lit the fuse of a chain reaction that is, arguably, still running today. Every time a rocket engine ignites, every time a power plant burns fuel, every time a surgeon uses a cauterizing tool at the base of all of it, there is a connection, however indirect, to that first deliberate spark. You might be wondering at this point, okay, this is all fascinating history, but why does it matter today? What's the practical takeaway from a deep dive into 400,000-year-old campfires? I think there are actually several things this story tells us that are urgently relevant right now. The first is about the nature of intelligence and discovery. The fire story is, at its core, a story about curiosity, about paying attention to something that everyone else had dismissed as background noise and asking, wait, could this be useful? The hominins who figured out fire-making were not doing science in any formal sense. They were doing what curious, observant minds do, noticing something, experimenting with it, and sharing the results. That basic loop, notice, try, share, is the engine behind every human advance. It was working 400,000 years ago, and it's working right now in labs and garages and research institutions all over the world. The second thing this story tells us is about the power of cultural transmission. Fire-making spread, was refined, and became universal among human populations not primarily through genetic evolution. That's too slow, but through teaching, through demonstration, through one generation showing the next how to do something that matters. The accumulated knowledge of 400,000 years of human fire use is embedded in everything from how we cook our food to how we design internal combustion engines. We are, all of us, beneficiaries of an unbroken chain of teaching that stretches back almost to the dawn of our species. That chain is both fragile and precious, and it's worth thinking about what we're adding to it. And the third thing, and this one I find personally moving, is about the universality of human ingenuity. The firemakers were not from any one place. They were not from any single culture or tradition. They were spread across a continent and more. They were, in terms of their technology and their world, almost unimaginably far from anything we'd call civilization. And yet they figured it out, through curiosity, through trial and error, through social sharing of knowledge. They cracked one of the hardest and most important problems their world had ever presented. The cognitive DNA of that achievement is in every human being alive today. I want to be honest with you before we wrap up, because as compelling as this story is, and as much as the evidence points in a clear direction, there is an enormous amount we simply don't know. And I think acknowledging that mystery is actually the most intellectually honest thing I can do. We don't know who the first deliberate firemaker was. We don't know if it was a man or a woman, old or young, a seasoned toolmaker or an impulsive experimenter. We don't know if the discovery was made in Africa, Europe or Asia first, or truly simultaneously in multiple places. We don't know whether it was greeted with awe, with fear, with suspicion, or with immediate practical excitement. We don't know whether the person who made that first spark understood what they had done, whether they had any capacity to grasp its significance, or whether it was just another useful discovery in a life full of practical problem-solving. We don't know what it felt like to be the first human community with fire. Did it feel miraculous? Did children gather around the first intentionally made flame with the same open-mouthed wonder that you might imagine? Or was it more incremental, a gradual shift from sometimes having fire to usually having fire to always having fire, with no single moment that felt like a threshold being crossed? The fossil record is extraordinary, but it is also silent on the most human dimensions of the story. The bones and the burned sediment and the chipped stones tell us what happened, more or less, and roughly when. They cannot tell us what it meant to the people involved. And that gap between the evidence and the experience is, I think, one of the most poignant things about studying deep prehistory. These were real individuals. They had personalities, they had fears and hopes and preferences. They had relationships that mattered to them, and we will never know them. Not really. What we have are their traces, the things they left behind, preserved by accident or circumstance, and the sometimes overwhelming awareness of how much has been lost. But here's what I take from that silence. The very fact that we are here, that you are listening to this, that I was able to research and write it, that billions of human beings are alive and thinking and creating and arguing and loving right now, all of that is the answer to the mystery. We don't know who started the fire, but we know what that fire made possible. It made possible everything that followed, including you. That is not a small thing. That might be the most important thing. So let's bring this full circle. 400,000 years ago, somewhere in the old world, maybe in a cave in what is now Israel, maybe on an open plain in what is now Europe, maybe near a shoreline in what is now Africa, a hominin did something new. They took a rock and struck it against another rock, Or they rubbed a stick against a dry board with careful rhythmic persistence, and they watched a spark catch, and instead of letting it die, they fed it, breathed on it gently, added tinder, coaxed it carefully into something that would last the night. And in that moment, in the shift from darkness to light, from cold to warmth, from danger to safety, something changed in the world that has never changed back. A threshold was crossed that cannot be uncrossed. A capability was unlocked that has only ever expanded. The world that existed before that moment and the world that exists right now are connected by an unbroken thread of fire, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, across every culture and every continent for 400,000 years. We tend to think of the great turning points in history as things that happened recently. The invention of the printing press, the Industrial Revolution, the digital age, and those are real turning points, but they are all downstream of something much older. They are all possible only because hundreds of thousands of years ago, someone looked at a spark and thought, I can use this. That instinct, that innately human impulse to look at a raw force in the world and find a way to make it serve you, to improve your life and the lives of the people around you, is not a modern invention. It is ancient. It is as old as fire. It is in you right now. The fire that was started 400,000 years ago has never gone out. It is burning in every engine, every stove, every furnace, every light bulb, every screen you have ever looked at. It is burning in the metaphor of every idea that has ever been called a spark. And it is burning in the deepest sense, in the curiosity that made you want to understand where it all began. Thank you for spending this time with me on one of the most extraordinary stories the human past has to offer. We've travelled a long way together, from the darkness before fire, through the biology and the cognition, and the social transformation and the spiritual weight of what fire became, all the way to the world it made possible. I hope this story stays with you. I hope the next time you see a flame, any flame, you feel something ancient in it, because you should, because you will. That's a wrap on this one, and as always, stay curious. If this deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in human history added something to your day, I'd love it if you gave this video a like. It helps more curious people find content like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a great time. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss the next deep dive. See you in the next one.